You're going to find this hard to believe, I still do. It started on one of those half-dream mornings, when the world feels suspended between night and day, and everything seems a little too unreal to question. That was the state I was in when my neighbor's son walked into my kitchen at dawn. What followed changed the way I thought about time, and about myself. But before I get to that moment, tell me, where are you watching from today? I've seen people tune in from everywhere, and it always feels like we're gathered in the same warm room sharing stories. And if this is your first time here, a gentle tap on that like button means more than you'd think. Anyway, that morning, I woke earlier than usual, maybe around 5:30. The sun hadn't broken through the blinds yet, but the birds were already whispering outside, those fragile dawn notes that sound hopeful, even when you don't feel it yourself. I'd been having trouble sleeping. Age, maybe, or loneliness, or the simple way silence grows heavier when no one else lives in the house. I shuffled into the kitchen in my old robe and started making coffee. The smell filled the room long before the light did, warm, safe, familiar. I leaned against the counter and watched the faint edge of sunrise color the curtains. That strange mix of emptiness and fullness always finds me at dawn. My husband's been gone for years now, sudden, without warning. My daughter moved across the country not long ago, so it's just me, wandering through this house that once held laughter, arguments, and the thumping music of a restless family. I wasn't expecting anyone to be awake, which is why the soft creak of the back door sent a jolt straight through me. I froze, coffee halfway to my lips. At first I told myself it was the wind until I heard footsteps, quiet, hesitant, as if someone didn't want to disturb the house. Then he appeared. My neighbor's son, older now than when he used to mow my lawn and shyly offer help with groceries. He stepped into the kitchen with a presence that filled the space before he even spoke. He apologized softly, explaining he needed the spare key I kept for his mother. She forgets things these days. Small things at first, but more often now. I've seen the confusion behind her eyes, and it scares me more than I admit. I told him he might as well have some coffee before heading back. He hesitated, then sat down across from me. The early light caught the angles of his face, familiar but changed, like life had carved new stories into him. For a while we didn't speak, just the hum of the coffee maker and the steady ticking of the clock. And then he said something that stayed with me. You ever notice how the world feels honest before everyone wakes up? I hadn't, but he was right. As we talked about his job, his mother's worsening forgetfulness, his return home after ending a relationship that left him feeling unseen, I felt something loosen inside me. He listened without rushing, without pretending. Truly listened. It had been years since I'd felt that kind of attention, that kind of presence. When he stood to refill his cup, the air shifted. He walked behind me, and for a moment his nearness, warm, quiet, steady, made it hard to breathe. He didn't touch me. He didn't need to. There was something understood in the glance we shared when he turned back. Something gentle, unexpected. He thanked me softly before leaving. And when the door clicked shut, the silence of the house felt different. No longer empty, just quiet, full. I stared at the mug he left behind and realized something had woken inside me. Something I thought had gone dormant years ago. I wasn't invisible. Not that morning. And that was only the beginning. The next day I woke before the alarm again. Sleep had been thin, but something about that dawn encounter replayed in my mind. His voice, his tired eyes, the warmth that lingered long after he'd gone. I told myself it meant nothing, but some moments refused to fade. I made my coffee the same way and looked out the window. There he was again, helping his mother in the garden. Even from a distance, I could see the exhaustion in his movements. The way he moved that morning caught my attention, careful, protective, as if every gesture carried the weight of someone who'd learned responsibility early in life. His mother noticed me watching and lifted a hand in greeting. I waved back, smiling, but my eyes lingered on her son as he stood upright and stretched. The early light traced the edges of his hair and softened the angles of his face. And in that moment I felt the same quiet warmth that had settled over my kitchen the day before. Something steady, something unexpectedly comforting. Around mid-morning, there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, he stood there holding a small basket filled with tomatoes and herbs. My mom wanted you to have these, he said with an almost shy grin. She always says your cooking tastes better when you use things from her garden. I stepped aside to let him in, laughing softly. She's not wrong, I said. Come in, I can make something out of these if you've got time for lunch. He hesitated for just a breath, then nodded. If you don't mind the company, I'd like the company, I admitted before I could talk myself out of it. As I chopped and stirred, he leaned against the counter like he belonged there, like he'd stood in that same spot a dozen times before. We talked about lighter things, music, films, stories from the years he'd been away. The conversation drifted easily, effortless as the scent of herbs warming in the pan. Yet every now and then a gentle quiet settled between us. Soft, unspoken, humming with meaning neither of us dared name. And I could feel his gaze now and again, steady, attentive, not intrusive, but enough to make me aware of myself in a way I hadn't been in years. Aware of the way I reached for the salt, how I brushed my hair behind my ear, how my smile folded at the corners. At one point, as I reached for a towel, our hands brushed. Just a passing touch. Barely anything. But it felt immediate, startling in its clarity. We both froze, then laughed it off, pretending it was nothing. Yet as I turned back to the stove, I felt the echo of that touch hanging between us like a quiet secret. After lunch, we sat at the table, the warm afternoon sunlight spilling across the floor in long golden streaks. He told me his mother's memory had been fading faster lately. How she sometimes forgot that her husband had passed years ago. I saw the ache behind his eyes, then an exhaustion that doesn't come from physical effort, but from loving someone you can't help the way you wish you could. I reached across the table and placed my hand gently on his. "You're doing right by her," I said softly. "I know how heavy that kind of care can be." He nodded, his thumb brushing lightly against my knuckles. "Sometimes I just need someone to talk to," he murmured. You do listen differently from most people. Maybe that's age," I said with a small smile. "Or maybe it's because I know how much silence can weigh if no one breaks it." He looked at me, then really looked, and the moment stretched into something warm and fragile. I pulled my hand back slowly, not because I wanted to, but because I was afraid of how deeply I might fall if I didn't. That evening, after he left, I stood on the porch watching the sky fade into dusk. The neighborhood was calm, wrapped in a gentle stillness. Across the yard, I saw the glow of his mother's kitchen window and imagined him moving around her with the same quiet patience he'd shown all afternoon. And I thought about my own life, how long it had been since someone had simply filled my day with presence instead of obligation, with warmth instead of noise. It wasn't romance. Not yet. It was connection, honest, unexpected, reminding me that I hadn't stopped feeling things after all. That maybe my story wasn't as finished as I'd convinced myself it was. Later that night, I tried to read, but every word blurred together. My mind drifted back to small moments: his laugh, the softness in his eyes, the warmth of his hand beneath mine. I wondered if he thought of them too, or if I was letting old dreams wake up again. Then my phone buzzed. A message. "Thank you for today," it read. It felt good to talk. "Haven't done that in a long time." I stared at the screen before typing back, "Me too. You're welcome here anytime." When I set the phone down, I realized I was smiling, a real smile, gentle and hopeful. The kind that comes from something beginning rather than ending. For the first time in years, I slept through the night. The next few days, he came by again, sometimes to borrow a tool, sometimes for a cup of coffee, sometimes just to sit quietly. A rhythm formed, light and natural, stitching our mornings together without either of us naming what it meant. But a part of me knew things never stay simple for long. Because when do people start to understand each other that deeply? Life eventually tests it. And soon it would. On the third morning in a row that I woke before sunrise, the house felt different, calm, expectant. I went through my usual motions, but my heartbeat aligned itself with something I didn't fully understand yet. I didn't plan to see him that day, but life rarely waits for plans. Around 6, as I watered the herbs by the window, I noticed movement outside. He was near my fence, not his own yard this time, leaning down, staring at something on the ground. His shirt, his collar was damp, his hair still untamed, and he looked as sleepless as I felt. I stepped onto the porch, mug in hand. "You're up early," I said softly. He turned, a faint smile touching his lips. "Could say the same about you. What brings you over?" I asked. He hesitated, then let out a quiet laugh, running a hand through his hair. "Mom's sleeping and I just needed, I don't know, a brother." "Come in," I said before I could stop myself. "Coffee's fresh." He didn't argue. The morning sunlight poured through the kitchen, thick and golden, casting everything in a honeyed glow. We sat at the same table where it all had begun. For a while, there was nothing but the gentle curl of coffee steam, as if the world had paused for us. "You ever feel like time moves differently around certain people? Like everything else slows down?" he asked. "Yes," I whispered. "Exactly," he nodded, relief flickering across his face. The air felt heavy, not with emptiness, but with something waiting, holding its breath. A distant bird called once, then went quiet. He leaned back, tracing the rim of his mug with a finger. "It's strange. Being here feels like I can finally breathe. Like I can think straight again. That's what a home is supposed to do," I replied. He glanced at me softly. "Maybe, but it's not my house that feels like that." A twinge of warmth and worry settled in me. I wanted to remind him about boundaries, about age, about how people might judge. But I felt it too, that quiet pull, the sense of calm when he was near. We didn't speak for a long time. Words would have broken it. Instead, we sat, two people from different chapters of life, finding steady ground in the same silence. Eventually, I stood to refill the pot. My hand trembled. I told myself it was the stove. When I turned, he was watching, really watching, like that first morning, with understanding, with respect. He rose slowly, stepping closer. For a heartbeat, I felt his presence, that quiet energy that filled the space between us. We didn't touch. We didn't need to. Standing side by side, the morning light resting on our shoulders felt like a secret. You should get some rest, I said softly. You've been carrying too much lately. He met my gaze. Maybe I have. But it doesn't feel heavy here. Then, almost afraid to say more, he turned toward the door. Thank you for letting me be here, always, I whispered. After he left, I stared at the empty chair. Time had felt different around him. The hours weren't ordinary. Over the next week, he came by often, afternoons or dawn. Our conversations deepened, fears, hopes, the losses we hadn't shared with anyone. In those talks, something tender grew. Not romance exactly, but a bond of quiet trust. A connection that sneaks in when you stop trying to name it. One afternoon, on the back steps, Carol's faint humming drifted across the yard. Lavender and rain clung to the air. You know, my dad used to sit like this, he said, just staring at the sky. He said it helped him remember what mattered, and what mattered to him. I asked. He smiled gently, present, calm. I nodded, feeling it settle deep inside me. That's good advice, I said. For anyone? He held my gaze, silently saying more than words could. Maybe that's why I like being here. You remind me of that. When he finally stood to leave, no goodbyes, just a nod. A promise in his eyes. As the sun disappeared behind the hills, I sat alone, but not lonely. For the first time in years, the silence around me felt like comfort instead of emptiness. Something was changing, and deep down, I knew neither of us could ignore it much longer. The morning of the storm began quietly. The air hung heavy, the sky the color of pewter, and even the birds seemed unsure whether to sing. I stood by the window, coffee cup in hand, watching the first streaks of gray stretch across the yard. It felt like a pause before something important. Carol had been having a hard week. Ethan mentioned it the night before when he dropped off a casserole. He looked more tired than usual, and there was a weight in his voice when he said his mom had one of her moments. Forgot where she was for almost an hour. I put a hand on his shoulder for a second and told him to call if he needed anything. I hadn't imagined he would call me that very morning. The rain began before sunrise. A steady tapping that grew into a drumbeat against the roof. Around 6, my phone rang. It was Ethan. She's scared, he said, his voice frayed at the edges. She doesn't recognize the house right now. I think she needs someone besides me. I'm coming, I said, already pulling on my coat. When I arrived, Carol sat on the couch, eyes darting between us, small and frightened. Ethan knelt beside her, patient, his hand resting gently on hers. Relief softened his face when he saw me. Hey, I said, crouching beside her. It's just me, Carol, you're home. Everything's all right. It took a while, but she started to calm. Her breathing steadied, and after a few minutes, Ethan guided her back to bed. When he returned, he leaned against the doorway, exhaustion written across him. She's asleep. He murmured, you need rest, too, I said. He shook his head, sinking into the chair. Can't, I keep thinking. What if she forgets me again? What happens then? I poured 2 cups of tea, setting one in front of him. The storm deepened, wind brushing against the windows. The air between us was quiet, charged with a kind of understanding that needed no words. You're doing everything you can, I said. Sometimes that has to be enough. His eyes, tired but full, met mine. Gratitude, maybe? Or the simple comfort of being seen. You've been there for both of us, he said softly. You don't have to thank me, I replied. That's what neighbors do. That's what friends do. The word friends caught in my throat because, by then, we both knew what lived between us wasn't just friendship anymore. Not romantic in the way people imagine when they are young, but real. Quiet, steady, undeniable. The power flickered, the light dimmed, then snapped back. Ethan laughed under his breath, shaking his head. This house feels smaller in storms, he said. So does mine, I replied, smiling faintly. He looked down at his hands, then back at me. Do you ever wish you could go back? To when things were simpler? I thought for a long time before answering. No, I said finally. Back then, I didn't understand how much moments like this mattered. The quiet ones. The hard ones. The ones that make you stop and feel something again. He nodded slowly, jaw tightening slightly as he swallowed whatever emotion was rising. We stayed like that for a while, listening to the rain, the storm wrapping the house in its gray hum. At one point, he reached across the table and took my hand, not hesitantly, not in question. Just a steady, human gesture. Warm, grounded. I didn't pull away. His thumb brushed lightly across my fingers, and for a moment, time did that strange thing again. It slowed, stretched, became endless. When the storm broke and light returned, everything seemed sharper. The air smelled of rain, earth, and new beginnings. I smoothed my sleeve. You should get some sleep now. You'll need your strength, he smiled faintly. Will you stay? Just for a bit, till the rain stops? And so I did. We sat in silence, watching droplets slide down the window. To people bound not by circumstance or expectation, but by something quieter, a shared understanding that life is fragile, that kindness is rare, and that connection sometimes finds you in the most ordinary places. When I finally walked home that afternoon, the storm had passed. The neighborhood smelled of wet grass and clean air. I looked up at the pale, streaked sky and felt something settle inside me. A peace I hadn't known in years. Later that evening, standing at my kitchen window again, I saw Ethan on his porch waving. I waved back. No words, no promises. Just a knowing look between us. Some stories don't need endings. They shift quietly into the fabric of your days. That morning, when Ethan first walked into my kitchen at dawn, I thought it was just another fleeting moment. Now I know it was the start of remembering myself, and for that, I'll always be grateful.